behavioral sciences يعني شنو أهمية ال behavioral sciences بالنسبة لكم؟ فأكو فكرة ببالكم يعني شنو أهمية ال behavioral sciences؟ ليش ندرس لكم إياها؟
دكتور ممكن حتى نفتهم تأثيرها، يعني تأثير نفسيتها على المرض إذا كان شخص مريض هيك شيء يعني.
نعم. يس.
زين دكتور، ممكن عكس اللي قاله إبراهيم إنه نقول شنو السلوكيات تتغير نتيجة مرض؟
نعم. نعم.
دكتور ممكن العفو، ممكن بعض مثلا clinical features انه تتغير يعني البيهيفير مال الشخص ككلينيكال فيتشر للديزيز.
نعم. فكل الأشياء اللي قلتوها صحيحة، إنه every physical disease has behavioral aspect. Every physical disease has behavioral aspect. كل الحالات المرضية اللي تواجهوها تشوفوها بالكلينيكال behavioral aspect، وهذه behavioral aspect قد تكون reaction to the illness، يعني psychological and behavioral reaction to the illness، وممكن تكون part of its pathophysiology، consultation behavior, compliance to treatment. All these can be influenced by factors related to the behavior of a specific patient. فكل هالاشياء اللي قلتوها صحيحه. Every physical disease has behavioral component. Next cause هو انه mental and behavioral conditions، يعني disorders. هذا another point مفيد ايضا، لذلك we study behavioral sciences. انه mental or behavioral conditions are very common، يعني maintenance the action in the doctor-patient relationship during the start and follow-up of the medical condition. فالفكرة إنه how our mind function، يعني the functions of our mind is that we perceive information from the surrounding. We perceive information through our senses، يعني we receive. طبعا هذه الانفورميشن اللي تجينا على شكل energy، physical energy، يعني الفيجن هي electromagnetic، acoustic هي sonic energy، التيست هي chemical energy، التكتايل هي physical energy. This energy is then translated into in our mind into meanings through thinking. We give them symbols and we think about these symbols in order to solve the current problem at hand. And then the meaning is registered in our mind, in the memory. And then we use this knowledge that we have learned in the future, and this is called learning. All these functions are accompanied by feelings. So these are the basic functions of our mind, is to perceive, think, remember, learn, and feel. And these functions can differ from individual to another. And people are variable in the capacities of these functions, and these variations are reflected in intelligence and in personality. And these variations will result in variations in behavior that can we see in the doctor-patient relationship, and can be influenced by any disease. What determine how our mind functions? يعني what determine these functions and variations in these functions? There are internal factors, inner factors, and situational factors. inner factors from biology, from genetics, situational factors from the surrounding, the social effect, interpersonal effects. فهنا إذا نجي على determinants of our behavior, what determine our behavior at any point in time. انتم موجودين يا شباب؟ اوكي، قاطعوني إذا عندكم أي استفسار أي سؤال بأي وقت. If we want to summarize the determinants of human behavior, then we talk about genetic determinants of behavior. Human behavior, there is considerable genetic contribution to how it shape itself. Biochemical, through the neurotransmitters. Physiological, through the structures of the brain that are responsible on behavior and how do they function. Growth and development, and by this we mean the psychological development from birth to adulthood. These factors will interact with each other: genetic, biochemical, physiological, growth and development, and this will result in variations in mental functions that will appear in the form of variation of intelligence and personality. And when the personality and intelligence are fully developed, then comes the interpersonal small and large group effects in determining our action at any point in time. فاحنا هنا يعني راح ناخذ بالbehavioral sciences. طبعا البولك of behavioral sciences اللي راح ناخذها هي growth and development and functions of the mind. المحاضرة مالت اليوم راح نسوي overview على الجينيتيك والبايوكيميكال والفيزيولوجيكال فاكتورز، نسوي عليها فد ريفيو. فراح نبدي بالجينيتيك determinants of behavior. اكو انواع من الجينيتيك ستاديز، هذه ريفيو يعني مفيده لكم شنو انواع الجينيتيك ستاديز. اكو توين ستاديز، يعني توين كونكوردنس ستاديز، اكو adoption studies، يعني twins or children are compared from original families and adopted families. Linkage studies يعني looking for specific genes. Chromosomal studies، هذه كلها أنواع من genetic studies. There are important concepts from genetics that we need to review them here, such as gene penetrance and gene expression and gene imprinting and gene anticipation. سامعين بهذه الconcepts سابقا؟
لا دكتور ما سامعني.
هي الحقيقه انتم يعني ينطوكم هوايه ثيوري، يمكن انتم موليكولر جينيتكس اعطوكم، مو؟ اخذتوا موليكولر جينيتكس؟ لو ما اخذتوا
دكتور احنا اخذنا موليكولر مرحله ثانيه بس ما اتذكر يعني كان بيها جينيتك.
اي فهو يعني قصدي انه يعني تاخذون هوايه ثيوري بس تبقى مفاهيم اساسيه نوبات تروح وتنسي. الجين بنترانس هنا we are talking about يعني genetic transmission. يعني suppose that we have an autosomal dominant trait. If the one of the parent is homozygous for that trait, then يعني إذا نحسبها يعني through the Mendelian genetics, all the offspring should be affected or should carry that trait. اللي يصير انه مو كلهم carry the trait، وهذا نسميه gene penetrance. يعني طبعا هذه concepts are related to Mendelian genetics, classical Mendelian genetics. Gene penetrance, how much the gene will be transmitted from the generation to another. يعني it is not necessarily that if one of the parents is homozygous for a trait, this trait then will be transmitted to all offsprings. وهذا هو اللي نقصد به gene penetrance, how much the gene is able to be transmitted from generation to another. Another concept is the gene expression. Again, the gene can be present but is not expressed, and the expression may depend on other factors other than the gene itself. يسموها epigenetic factors. وواحدة من عدها قد تكون environmental factors that determine the expression of gene. Another concept is gene imprinting. هنا the same gene will give different expression depending on the parent of origin, whether it is coming from the father or of the mother. هذا يسموه gene imprinting. هي the same gene بس إذا جاية من الأب تعطينا تريت شكل وإذا جاية من الأم تعطينا تريت شكل. هذا نسميه gene imprinting. Gene anticipation means that the trait will express itself earlier and in a more prominent way with successive generations. هذه يسموها gene anticipation. Okay. هذه ريفيو للبيسك جينيتيك كونسبتس اللي هي ممكن تكون مفيدة يعني في بعض البيهيفيرال بروبلمز. طبعا genes يعني can affect people during health, وهذا during health يعني it will be reflected in variations in mental functions that are reflected in personality and in intelligence. طبعا personality and intelligence not follow single gene rule. Actually multiple genes play a role in determining personality and intelligence. And during illness, again, some genetic factors are involved in causing certain illnesses. راح نسوي ريفيو سريع disorders, common genetic conditions. We have chromosomal conditions. In the 6 chromosomes, we have the Fragile X syndrome. Fragile X syndrome, هذا اسمه Fragile X يعني X chromosome, the chromatin of the X chromosome will be fragile during the preparation, during karyotyping. يسموها Fragile X syndrome, which is the most common cause of mental retardation in males. Most common cause of a chromosomal based mental retardation in males. Second, autosomals, we have Down syndrome. Down syndrome اللي هي trisomy, trisomy 21 اللي هو most common cause of mental retardation in general. يعني genetically based mental retardation. أو اللي هي حاليا تسمى learning disability. انتم طبعا راح تصادفون مرضى ممكن تشوفوا يعني patients with learning disability they are more vulnerable to other physical congenital malformations, and you will see them during clinical practice. Talking about genes, examples, we have the Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is caused by an autosomal dominant gene at chromosome 4 with 100% penetrance and gene anticipation. يعني بالهانتنغتون disease نشوف 100% penetrance و gene anticipation. Huntington disease is يعني تبدي به هي chorea بس بعدين ممكن تتطور إلى other neuropsychiatric manifestations. Wilson's disease, this is a recessive, autosomal recessive condition. tuberous sclerosis is another autosomal recessive condition, can be complicated by temporal lobe epilepsy and learning disability. طبعا Wilson's disease can affect the liver, the kidneys and the brain. وممكن manifestation of Parkinsonism together with the neuropsychiatric manifestations. فهذه هي يعني ريفيو سريع. احنا طبعا يعني مو الهدف هنا انه نعطيكم كل الجينيتيك determinants of behavior. الهدف هنا انه نعطيكم ريفيو سريع للبيسك concepts and review to the common genetically based syndromes that you may face in clinical practice. بالنسبة للسايكاتريك syndromes, psychiatric disorders, إذا كانت depression, إذا كانت anxiety, إذا كانت schizophrenia, they follow a multiple genes inheritance, يعني rather than single gene inheritance. And always there are multiple genes involved when we are talking about depression, about anxiety, about schizophrenia, about bipolar disorder, about dementia. These conditions specifically have high genetic contribution in its etiology, in their etiology, and the genetic contribution follow multiple gene effect rather than single gene effect. فهذه مثل ما قلنا example schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and Alzheimer's disease. We go on and talk about the physiological determinants of behavior. أكو سؤال لحد الآن؟ Okay. The structures that influence behavior, يعني the main system involved هو limbic system. الليمبيك سيستم او يسموه الفص الحدي يقع عند حدود الدماغ القديم. It is phylogenetically old cortex. يعني هذه الكورتكس اللي بيها الليمبيك سيستم يعني evolutionally it is an old cortex and it is different from the new cortex. فهذه يسموه archean كيفالون الدماغ القديم مقارنة بالنيون كيفالون أو الدماغ الحديث اللي هو الكورتيسيز represented by the cortices. For all the brain, this old brain يعني حتى histologically it is different. It is composed of 3 layers of neurons, while the neoencephalon, the cortices, are composed of 6 layers of neurons. This system include the hippocampi, the fornix, mammillary bodies, the anterior thalamus, the cingulate gyrus, the septal nuclei, the amygdala. All these structures are interconnected and they work in circuits, and actually these circuits are a subject of continuous research in the neurosciences, and every time new information come up from these researches about how these structures are interconnected and how can they influence behavior, whether during illness or during health. But they function in modulation of emotions, of motivation, of aggression, sexuality, memory. كل هذه الفانكشنز يعني تكون part within the limbic structures. يعني احنا هنا اذا نضيف لها البرسبشن والthinking والlearning هي cortical functions، يعني functions of the neoencephalon: perception, thinking and learning الميموري in between both cortical and limbic. هنا more deeper functions are involved in the limbic system, such as emotions, motivation, instincts, aggression, sexuality, and again memory. Clinical attributes, يعني amnesia, one of the clinical conditions that we may face in clinical practice. It is caused by bilateral damage to the hippocampi, وهذا ممكن يصير بالثايمين deficiency، ممكن بال herpes simplex encephalitis. واكو other syndromes حقيقة هي matter of يعني research، يعني clinical syndromes in which motivation, aggression and sexuality is affected. ما اتيت على ذكرها، يعني اكو syndrome اسمها كلوفر-بوسي syndrome in which كلوفر-بوسي syndrome اذا سامعين بيها in which there is bilateral damage to the amygdala. شافوا انه يصير بيها hyperphagia and hypersexuality and excessive sleep. من هذه يعني يكتشفون انه functions, specific functions of these structures, and then they theorize about these functions. And as I have said, these structures work in circuits and they are extensively connected to each other, and there is continuous research about their functions. Temporal lobe epilepsy is another clinical attribute. When seizures start at the temporal lobe, then there will be behavioral manifestations, ممكن hallucinations, ممكن automatic behavior that occur all of a sudden and then disappear. Okay. Still talking about the about the physiological determinants of behavior in the reticular activating system, which is the mesh of neurons that is present in the brainstem, and this is the phylogenetically the oldest cortex. هنا نقصد phylogenetically oldest يعني أقدم جزء موجود بالدماغ من الناحية النشوئية تطورية، يعني موجود يعني هذا reticular activating system موجود في يعني in most earlier primates الرئيسيات الأولى، يعني يكون human being belong to the primates and he is on the top of the level of primates. The reticular activating system is present in the earliest primates and continue to exist in humans. It is phylogenetically oldest. All sensory and motor pathways pass through the reticular activating system, and it act by filtration of necessary information from unnecessary information according to need of the situation. Okay. It has diffuse connection with the cortex, and this diffuse connection with the cortex will determine the level of arousal of cortex, again according to the need of situation and according to the need of the function at a specific time. يعني هسه مثلا أنا دا أتحدث وياكم دا أتحدث knowledge، هذه النولج تحتاج تحفيز للكورتكس عندكم، للفرونتال كورتكس، تحتاج أول شيء attention من عندكم، انتباه على المعلومة، وبعدين هذه المعلومة ربطها ويا معلومات سابقة بالميموري. فهنا two parts will work، اللي هي الفرونتال لوب اللي هو responsible on attention، والtemporal lobes اللي هي responsible on memory. فلما اني اتحدث وياكم صوتي هذا اللي تسمعوه الانرجي هذه الفوكال انرجي اللي تجي من عندي تحفز الاكوستيك انرجي in your ears and this will be translated into the frontal cortex and the temporal cortex. واذا نسويكم هسه نيورو ايمجينج يشوف المنتبهين طبعا على المحاضره مو المنتبهين، المنتبهين نشوف انه there is activity in the frontal and the temporal lobes وهذه الاكتيفيتي is mediated through activation from the reticular activation system. اذا واحد ما راح ينتبه على المحاضره ايش راح يصير؟ there will be no arousal at the reticular activation system and gradually there will be no stimulation to the cortex and gradually the slow waves of the reticular activating system will dominate our brain and you will find yourself sleepy after a few minutes. هسه اعتقد اكو مجموعه يعني sleepy ومجموعه attentive، شو تقولون؟ اوكي فواضحه الفكره انه هذا الستيميوليشن from the brainstem will determine the parts of the brain that are needed at any point in time وهذا له اهميه يعني له اهميه نشوئيه هو يعني له اهميه في الحفاظ على حياتنا. يعني هسه احنا اذا قاعدين احنا هسه منتبهين على المحاضره اذا نسمع دويه قويه الفير centers will be stimulated we will leave everything and will run away. That this stimulation of the fear centers come from يعني the control come from the arousal that is mediated from the reticular activating system. طبعا all these processes are mediated through neurotransmitters بما انه هو يعني reticular activating system function by filtration of information necessary or unnecessary information then it will have play a role in schizophrenia when this filtration of information is not proper there may be information without source وهذه نسميها hallucinations مثل ما راح تشوفون ان شاء الله بالصف الخامس. إذا نجي على نعم
انت هذا الريتيكولار فورميشن تشيل الحفظ غير الساوند اسمه ما يحفظ يمكن
كل الحواس تحفزه وراح يختار من الحواس اللي هي لها برايورتي يعني شنو البرايورتي for the individual at any point in time. هل هي البرايورتي انه to save life يخلي هاي البرايورتي اول شيء بعدين يخلي برايورتيز للنيدز البيسك نيدز يعني هسه انتم اذا جوعانين ما راح تقدرون تنتبهون على المحاضره تنتبهون على المعده الفارغه من البيسك نيدز fulfilled بعدين تقدر تنتبه على more sophisticated motives اللي هي مثلا learning انه انا اريد اتعلم behavioral sciences فانتبه راح ينطي تحفيز للفرونتال كورتكس انه انتبه على المحاضره اللي هسه تتقدم. اوكي موجودين انتم يا شباب؟
موجودين.
اوكي مثل ما قلنا هذا كله all this is mediated through biochemical changes through electrical circuits and these electrical circuits transmission through which is through neurotransmitters. فهنا psychopharmacology يعني substances external from our body will influence the functions of our mind. Neurotransmitters are important in function of our mind. We neurotransmitters can exert action directly through receptors or through second messengers and intracellular processes. راح نتحدث عن neurotransmitters والmain neurotransmitters involved in human behavior. You see that there is large number. أنا طبعا راح آخذ وقتكم لحد النهاية لحد ساعة واحدة لأن بدينا متأخرين شوية. So we have the monoamines. Monoamines include the catecholamines and serotonin. We have the acetylcholine. We have the amino acids, and we have the neuropeptides. These are examples of neurotransmitters that act at our brain. الكاتيكولامينز اللي هي تشمل النورادرينالين and adrenaline and dopamine واللي هن they are derived from phenylalanine and tyrosine as amino acids, basic amino acids for being substrate for the synthesis of catecholamines, phenylalanine and tyrosine. Dopamine, if we want to talk about dopamine, dopamine is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. The major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. It acts through control of sensory information. يعني هذه اللي قلنا انه احنا كل السنسز تجي للبرين ستيم للريتيكولار اكتيفيتنج سيستم. مو كل الانفورميشن احنا يعني ناخذ الريليفنت and this relevance of information is mediated through the action of dopamine. Dopamine will select what to inhibit and what to let it go. It is involved in the reward mechanism. Dopamine again involved in the reward mechanism, يعني the sense of reward when we do something pleasurable and we need to repeat it again and again. This feeling of reward is mediated through dopamine. Novelty seeking trait, يعني الناس اللي يحبون المغامرة يعني شافوا انه عندهم low levels of basic dopamine transmission. بما انه هو inhibitory فاذا اذا هو قليل فاذا راح يكون الانهبيشن قليل، فلذلك يحبون المغامره، يحبون الاشياء الجديده، يملون من الرتابه، عندهم basic dopamine low. It is يعني basically present in substantia nigra in the brainstem. يعني main nuclei are present in the substantia nigra in the brain, and there are pathways that go to the mesolimbic, to the limbic system, mesolimbic pathway, وهذا involved in schizophrenia. There is nigrostriatal pathway هو نفسه من السبستانشيا نايجرا، ذاك اسمه ميزوليمبيك. ميزوليمبيك يعني من الميد برين، هي السبستانشيا نايجرا صايره بالميد برين. الميزوليمبيك يعني from the midbrain to the limbic system، وهذا involved in schizophrenia. Nigrostriatal pathway from the substantia nigra to the striatum، وهذا involved in Parkinson's disease. اكو hypothalamic pituitary pathway اللي هو responsible on secretion of prolactin. فهذه هي المين pathways of dopamine. مثل ما قلنا هو يعني له role بالcontrol of sensory information. That's why it is involved in schizophrenia and involved in reward mechanism and in novelty seeking. And norepinephrine is a modulatory neurotransmitter. A modulatory neurotransmitter. It is important in attention, concentration, sleep. اوكي؟ يعني هنا مثل ما قلت لكم احنا يا جزء من الكورتكس تتحفز باي لحظه من اللحظات يعتمد على الأراوزل، وهذا الأراوزل come from secretion of norepinephrine from the locus cerebrus again in the brainstem. Okay, there is extensive connection from the locus cerebrus to all over the cortex. فإذا المعلومة اللي بتسمعوها تحسوها مهمة راح تتحفز الاتنشن بالفرونتال لوب والكونسنتريشن، وإذا لا بالعكس راح يصير sleep. It is also important in reward dependence. يعني ايش قد احنا يعني rewarded for العفو مو reward، هذه العفو خطأ. harm novelty seeking, reward dependence. Yes, true. Reward dependence. It is involved in reward dependence. يعني ايش قد نحتاج انه هذا السلوك مالتنا يكون rewarded. يعني لما اكو high norepinephrine we find ourselves, basic norepinephrine, we find ourselves seeking reward for every action we want to do. مثل ما قلنا, it is widely distributed all over the cortex. It is widely distributed all over the cortex. It has relationship to mood disorders. طبعا اكو relationship between norepinephrine and depression. يعني هذه المونوامين ثيوري تقول اكو decrease in monoamine transmission in depression, وبالعكس increase in monoamine transmission in mania. Serotonin is another monoamine, but it is not a catecholamine. Catecholamines تشمل الدوبامين and norepinephrine. طبعا الابinephrine هو peripheral مو central. Serotonin, again, it is modulatory neurotransmitter. It is derived from tyramine and tryptophan rather than phenylalanine and tyrosine مثل ما شفنا بالنسبة للكاتيكولامينز. هنا السبستريت يختلف. It is secreted from Raphe nuclei, again in the brainstem. Raphe nuclei in the brainstem. So it is involved in mood. يعني أيضا يعني serotonergic theory of depression نقول decrease in serotonin in depression. In aggression, again, there is decreased serotonin transmission and it has effect on sleep, appetite, and in harm avoidance. Those with high levels of basic serotonin in the CNS, they try to avoid harm excessively. يعني يصيرون anxious people, a personality. Acetylcholine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It is basically present at the nucleus basalis of Meynert, اللي هي located at the medial posterior part of the frontal lobe, bilateral, واللي هي لها أهمية بالميموري والألزهايمر's disease. Nucleus basalis of Meynert, memory and Alzheimer's disease. It is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Cholinergic system also is present in the basal ganglia and act together with the dopaminergic systems there, together with the nigrostriatal pathway in coordination of movement. And there is balance between the cholinergic system and the dopaminergic system. So disturbances in the dopaminergic or in the cholinergic systems are involved in Parkinson's disease. Amino acids, examples of the amino acids, we have the gamma aminobutyric acid, and the glycine. The gamma aminobutyric acid is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter which is involved in anxiety, اللي هو receptor for benzodiazepines. Gamma aminobutyric acid receptor has a locus at which benzodiazepines exert their action. Glycine, مثل ما قلنا, it is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Neuropeptides هي من اسمها peptides وتشمل opioids, endorphins, الهرمونز. كل الهرمونز هي neuropeptides. كل الهرمونات اللي تعرفوها الموجودة بالجسم هي neuropeptides. They have relationship to the dopaminergic system, so they are involved in schizophrenia. They play a role in the reward mechanism that we talked about when we were talking about dopamine. So they are involved in addiction and in pain. Other cortisol, LH, FSH, melatonin، مثل ما قلنا كل الهرمونز هي نيوروبيبتايدز، وكل البيبتايدز هي كل الهرمونز هي يعني they act as neurotransmitters or co-transmitters. وكل الانفلاماتوري ميدياترز اللي تعرفوها، كل الانفلاماتوري ميدياترز اللي تعرفوها من الانترلوكينز للانترفيرونز للهستامين، كل الانفلاماتوري mediators that are secreted in inflammatory processes, they exert or have action as transmitters or co-transmitters. The interaction between neurotransmitters is very complex at the CNS, and this is another field of continuous research. Okay. انتم موجودين يا شباب؟
وياك دكتور.
اوكي. يعني كمادة علمية خلصت يعني